next special speaker is Rodney Ellis. Since November 2016, Rodney has been the Harris County Commissioner for Precinct One, which includes 1 million people in the city of Houston, Texas. He was on the Texas State Senate for over 25 years and Houston's District D City Council for 7 years. Rodney believes that the role of government is to ensure that all people have the opportunity and ability to build a better future for themselves. And in this slide, he will discuss the controversy over the outrageous widening of Interstate 45, which will displace and destroy 1,000 homes, businesses, schools, and places of worship in mainly Black and Latino neighborhoods. Rodney Ellis.
Mike, I'm going to make sure the slides work. I'm going to let my partner handle the slides. While I set it up, Jeff, thank you for inviting me to be here. I have had the privilege of traveling a good bit of the world, but I'll tell you a secret. I have never been to Seaside. My family comes every year, and they've been coming for about 20 years. In fact, our last one is a freshman at Syracuse, and I sent her some pictures. She'll be back in 2 weeks. And I used to always say my favorite city in the world was, other than Houston, where I represent, obviously, I always thought my favorite place was Cape Town. It is a walkable city, by the way, but I will be back. It's a hell of a lot easier to get here than those 18 hours to get to Cape Town, particularly when it's about 26 when you go through Joburg. So my partner, Alicia Green, is going to help me out with this. She also happens to be my wife. Mike told me last night, hey, why don't we skip the slides and then we'll just talk, as politicians are prone to do, but I opted not to do that because my staff did so much work on this, and my wife is here to help me. As he said, I've been in politics a long time. Mike, I'm embarrassed to say I was sitting there thinking about it. I was first elected to office as student council president in 1971 in high school. And then I went on city council in Houston in 83. I think Royer was the mayor of Seattle. So that tells you I've been around for a very long time. When I got into politics, Houston was a far different place than what it is today. I've traveled the world, as I said, but I spent my whole life in Houston for the most part. It has been transformed. It has ballooned like many cities. I was born in 54. We had a population of 600,000 then. Now, in the new Houston, we have a population in the region, the metro area, of 6.5 million people, 10 times bigger than it was when I was born. Harris County, where I'm a county commissioner, has a population of 4.7 million people. That makes it larger than 14 states in this country in terms of population. Everything's bigger in Texas, obviously. You may wonder, what does a county commissioner do? Well, we have 254 counties in Texas. Sometimes I wonder what we do as well. The smallest county has a population of 64 people. I represent Precinct One. Harris County has a brilliant county judge. She was 27 years old when she was elected, countywide, and 4 of us from precincts. I've got about 1.2 million people in my precinct. Precinct One alone has 1.2 million residents, 8 cities, over 1,000 road miles that I'm in charge of. That means unincorporated Harris County. That does not count the road miles in the city. So that means I cover enough roads to go from Orange to El Paso to cross the state of Texas. in terms of roads I'm responsible for. 62% of the people that I represent live in the city of Houston. Historically, people thought that county commissioners were just pot-bellied old men. I guess I am one. And they only focused on maintaining roads and bridges. I walked out of the state senate. I was not run out. I didn't get defeated. I was third in seniority. I walked out not just to build roads, but I wanted to focus on how to give people a road to a better future. Houston is a population center of the state, and it's also the population center of my county. And it is one of the most diverse counties, and Houston is clearly the most diverse city in the country. It's also a very segregated city and a segregated county. Precinct One that I represent exemplifies that inequality that comes from that segregation. We have some of the wealthiest neighborhoods. I have the privilege of living in one now. Nothing like the neighborhood I came out of. Multiple universities. We've got the largest medical center in the world. We also have some of the most socially vulnerable neighborhoods in the country, including communities where residents have to live next to concrete batch plants and are exposed to cancer-causing toxins. Depending on where a Harris County resident lives, their life expectancy might change by more than 15 years. Historically, the county, Harris County, has not invested in the city of Houston. Other counties, but not the crown jewel, not the county seat. Although people in Houston pay a disproportionate share of property taxes that we use to fund county government. The intentional lack of investment has disproportionately harmed neighborhoods that have been redlined, divided by highways, and made vulnerable by industry. Focusing solely on unincorporated areas prioritizes the newer communities in our county rather than the historically neglected neighborhoods. And that has led to many of the unequal outcomes for constituents that I represent. It's interesting. Houston, by the way, Harris County has more people in unincorporated Harris County than in the city of Houston. Think about that, digest that for a second. The largest city in Texas is really something called unincorporated Harris County. That is truly the wild, wild west. When I came to county government, I knew we had to change that dynamic and invest more in the city. And it's when voters decided that a new governing majority would control county government, we had a shot to do that. I mentioned when Lena Hidalgo ran and won, it was a big surprise. She's 27 years old. I might say one of the better educated politicians I have ever been around. She has a bachelor's degree from Stanford. She was working on a joint degree, Harvard, at NYU. We decided that we would make equity a big focus of everything we do. And we wouldn't treat equity as just a six-letter word, but really focus on it. Through infrastructure investments, we change how capital investments are made from the county side. We're attempting to set a new standard for how North American cities on the front line of the climate crisis and other environmental crises can flourish, at least survive in the 21st century. And we set that standard without considering, by investing in all of our residents, regardless of what municipality they live in, what they look like, what their religion is, it didn't matter. We firmly believe that somebody's zip code ought to not determine their destiny or their ability to make it in life. Designing for and investing in a better future is certainly not easy. A room full of placemakers like you are probably aware Houston is the largest unzoned city in the world. There are restrictions in place if you live in a neighborhood like Alicia and I have the privilege of living in now that give you certain protections, but it is the largest unzoned city in the world. Schools are located right next to freeways. Scrap metal recycling plants share property lines with family homes, and garages are built next to 100-year-old cottages. Our growth has also taken the form of massive sprawl, as anyone who visited and sat in our traffic can tell you. The sprawl doesn't serve our people or our planet, and it certainly doesn't help the residents in the city of Houston. as their homes are bulldozed for highways to move cars between downtown and the suburbs. Texas politics has become so polarized that it's hard to make investments that improve the quality of life for everybody in our region. And it's especially hard to make those decisions and improvements in cities where progressive, oftentimes African American and Hispanic leaders are in control of the urban areas. Even in Texas cities that have zoning, the state is using preemption to stonewall efforts to make community planning more inclusive and progressive. Austin, where I resided part-time for 27 years, 150 miles up the road from Houston, has grabbed headlines recently for its population growth and lack of affordability. Austin leaders attempted both inclusionary zoning and linkage fees in recent years, but the efforts have been thwarted by state leadership. The state has also limited our ability to hold polluters accountable. Texas laws have weakened local government's capacity to sue polluters. In 2019, a massive fire from a petrochemical facility burned for 60 hours and created a plume of black smoke visible across the county and the entire region. And yet, on the county level, we were only able to recoup $900,000 from a multinational corporation with multiple violations of the Clean Air Act because of state law. Those who suffer the most from aggressive, callous state government are the same people who've been disenfranchised by government time and time again. From redlining to fair housing struggles to exposure to toxins and increased climate risk. They're mostly people who look like me or speak Spanish. This is a hard place to try and make necessary and urgent change that our cities and families deserve. But it's not without hope. It's not all negative. One of the places where I find hope and comfort is on my bicycle. Biking is my passion, and I have done it all around the world. Trust me, I've got pictures of me biking through Tripoli, passing by brother leader Muammar Gaddafi billboards. Wherever I go, I get on a bicycle because it reminds me of the wrongs that need righting and the future that we can still have. Biking has helped me to see my city and my county and neighborhood spaces that are ripe for transformation. When I left the Senate and came to this county position in 2017, I directed my team to come up with opportunities across the region to see if we could show people, we could prove to them that we could transform their neighborhoods. Even though capital projects take forever, I'm shocked. I passed 700 bills during my career in the Senate. I had no idea it would take so long just to build a damn sidewalk. But it takes a long time dealing with governmental agencies. But here's some things we have achieved. First, I announced that we put $30 million into complete street investments for two of our major universities. With equity being my lens, one is a historically Black university that I graduated from in undergraduate school. The other one was University of Houston across the street. That $30 million turned into $43 million. We're investing in over 66 miles of street improvements, bringing complete streets and multimodal improvements in my precinct. Much of it in the city limits of Houston, but some of it in the unincorporated areas that I represent as well. I also challenged my mayor, the mayor of Houston, to invest in quick bikeways in the urban core just to give people a sense of what we could do. I put up $10 million, and I told the city, you had to use it or lose it in 1 year. It resulted in tripling the city high comfort bikeways by adding 18 miles. My original intent was to bring Seville, of all places, to Houston. In the end, we also invested in sidewalks, accessibility and transit improvements, and spotlighted a need for maintenance of these facilities. The initial 18-mile network is now 62 miles of projects in various phases. Of course, access to biking infrastructure is useless if you don't have a bike. And sometimes my staff would criticize me and say, Rodney, You got to make sure these bike lanes you're putting in are not just for you and your Anglo friends. You got to have some diversity on biking in these neighborhoods. So we invested in 47 stations and 483 pedal bikes. And we're jump-starting publicly available e-bikes by funding the first 100. I've also made a commitment that I'll do a dollar-for-dollar match with our not-for-profit B-Cycle up to $1 million. I'll give them $1 million that I control from my precinct. If they can get it from the city, they can get it from the federal government, match it somewhere, because I have to leverage the dollars I have. Not everyone sees themselves biking on a roadway. Given our natural man-made drainage systems, we're investing in 36 miles of trails, in parks and bayous and detention basins. The need for safety improvement in our communities is significant. Too often, I've seen students on these desire paths. New term I picked up leaving the state legislature and being a county commissioner. Kids walking to school on the side of roadways or along open ditches. We invest in 60 miles of sidewalks to improve access to schools and public transit. If you're not from the Gulf South, you're probably not very familiar with bayous. When I was in college in New Orleans for a year, they call them bayous. So I go back and forth between the two. In Harris County, bayous have long been used as a form of flood mitigation. Most days they are they're basically dry, no water in them. But after a big storm, a couple I could mention, you remember seeing in the national press, these bayous and the land nearby is filled with water. They're almost unrecognizable. But bayous are no longer solely synonymous with water detention, thanks to Bayou Greenways. It's a public-private partnership. $220 million in Harris County that has helped turn gray infrastructure green with 150 miles of trails and 3,000 acres of green space, linear parks throughout Houston. As you know, when you're doing a public-private partnership, it's the last money that's most difficult to raise. So from Precinct One, out of my budget, even with a little criticism, I put in the last $10 million. County land, city bond issue for $100 million, private sector raised $110, Precinct One put up the last $10 million. Bayou Greenways has created public spaces that serve as reminders that our landscape doesn't have to be defined by its hazards or concrete. The project also represents how we're shifting the experience of our region for our residents from an experience of sprawl to an experience of connecting communities all throughout the region. It's a shift we've been making steadily as we invest in our region's first housing plan, regional housing plan, city and the county. We began the climate justice planning process, and we start to treat infrastructure as an essential public health and safety item. Now, Jeff, I'll get to why you asked me to come today. The State Department of Transportation. I've been in politics so long, we used to call it the Highway Department. Sometimes I still do that. It had a very different vision for the residents of Harris County and the new leadership that runs the county now. TxDOT is the same agency that built this, if you can see it on the screen. The Katy Freeway, which at one point was the widest freeway in the world. I'm counting those lanes off the main freeway as well. But if you get on one, you think that's a freeway as well. If you continue about 600 miles west from Seaside, you'll arrive at the Katy Freeway. At its widest point, it is 26 lanes across. I think now, technically, the widest freeway in the world is in China. TxDOT said the freeway was supposed to reduce traffic in our growing region. In fact, as this group knows, what happens when you get more highways? You get more cars. According to a 2020 Transportation of America report, roadway expansions have increased congestion by 144% in this country. TxDOT's governing legislation is stuck in the last century and prohibits any agency from investing in public transit solutions. I must admit, federal law is also stuck in a different century because most of the money that goes to TxDOT from the federal government is also restricted to highways and it's difficult to use it for mass transit. Here is what our state highway agency is doing to cities across Texas. They're building wider and wider freeways around cities, funding public infrastructure for sprawl and air pollution, while continuing a pattern of displacement of mostly Black and Hispanic and always low-income communities by large infrastructure projects. Then, as wealthier suburbanites want to commute in their single occupancy gas guzzlers to the urban core for a theater or to go in for employment, it creates congestion. Nobody wants to acknowledge or point out most of that congestion is going on 2 hours a day, rush hour in the morning and the afternoon. Or, as the case is now, everybody's going in to go to the rodeo. Our current battle with TxDOT centers around Interstate 45. In 61, a roadway known as the Gulf Freeway underwent an expansion to become Interstate Highway 45. That same decade, 3 other freeways in the area were rammed through mostly poor neighborhoods of color, 5th Ward and 3rd Ward, as we refer to them in particular. It's important to note that there has always been opposition to these kinds of projects, as evidenced by the headlines that you can see in a local Black newspaper. I-45 stretches from the coast to Galveston and on through Houston and then to Dallas. Conveniently for some, I-45 cuts straight through downtown Houston and provides a direct route to the city for more affluent suburbs like the Woodlands, a master plan community conceived and developed by a big supporter of mine, by the way, George Mitchell. Here's a quote that he used in ads. It was developed to entice city slickers looking for far-flung suburban quality of life. I might add, if you Google the Woodlands, they got a grant from the federal government to help develop it. They did a little low-income housing. I challenge you to go find it now. I should note that Woodlands is also home to an Exxon campus. Since the early 2000s, TxDOT has been planning this I-45 expansion. Mainly through the Senate district I represent. I was at the height of my power in the Senate in 2001. I was chair of the Senate Finance Committee. I'm a fairly bipartisan guy. There were 16 Republicans in the Senate, 15 Democrats. And I ended up chairing the most important committee in the state Senate. The neighborhoods that would be most negatively affected by the expansion of this highway are those minority neighborhoods that have been neglected and mistreated for decades. The expansion would claim, as you heard earlier, 1,235 homes, including the one you see on the screen, 24,873 jobs, and 27 acres of green space, including White Oak Park, which is part of that Bayou Greenways effort that I spoke about. But TxDOT won't classify that as a park because then we could really stick it to them. So they say it's solely gray infrastructure. The project cost is $7 billion. I think it'll be like that $30 million I put up for the 2 universities. That $7 billion will be $10 billion before it's over with. It'll condemn us to more flooding, more pollution, construction going on for years. Unsurprisingly, many community members are upset about it. Thankfully, as this project was rolling along the way state highway departments normally do it, they just come tell you what they're going to do, and then the local politicians are so glad to get the money or afraid of the contractors, they just say thank you. Then guess what happened? Somebody invited Jeff to Houston. Obviously, he didn't know that most people have guns. He had the unmitigated gall to speak at a packed house of players throughout the city and asked an amazing question. Jeff, we were in Commissioner's Court meeting, so I couldn't get over there, but I watched the video later. And I really borrowed your phrase as my title for this talk. Here was your challenge. Who made TxDOT your city planner? Only somebody from the outside, as bold as he is, would walk into the concrete capital of America and say that. Jeff's words energized community leaders, embarrassed some people like me into really getting active and pushing back. Community groups knocked on doors, organizers, and county staff in particular met with a host of people to come up with ideas on how to make the project better or stop it. In order to be a good public servant, I have to be real about population growth. I mentioned earlier, look, I'm a Democrat, and I know what it's like to be in power. I know what it's like to be in the minority. Sometimes I point out to my colleagues on Commissioners Court who are in the minority now, it's not so bad. I've been in the minority all of my life. Only in America could you get to the heights that I've achieved. But in order to be a good public servant, you got to listen. Being a good politician, Jeff, you ask for what you want, then you take what the hell you can get. That's just the nature of politics. Understanding the need for alternatives, Harris County and the city of Houston came together to fund a meaningful community engagement process. That means we paid for it. We developed designs, took into account our residents and desires and some of the future challenges facing our region. Previous public engagement conducted by TxDOT, especially with regard to the environmental concerns, were only done in English. There are so many languages spoken in Houston and Harris County, I don't even know the names of all of the language that people speak. And it's beautiful. Our publicly funded community engagement sessions offered TxDOT a chance to listen to residents and change some of their designs. And look, we naively thought that they would make some changes. But instead, TxDOT doubled down. The agency's final environmental impact statement ignored the conversations that occurred in community planning, and basically it was their way or the highway. They would continue using eminent domain and adding lanes. TxDOT forged ahead with their original plans. Their relocation specialists and brokers began reaching out to residents, making TxDOT's intentions clear. And they didn't care about the health or what we had to say. Here's a line I used on them. I said, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, even historic neighborhoods in America's fourth largest city. The agency ignored the civil rights and environmental concerns that residents have been bringing forward for years. Since TxDOT was not playing fair, Harris County decided to file a lawsuit over environmental concerns. Now, digest that for a second. For those of you who may not play local or state politics that much, it's incredibly rare, Mike, for a county to sue the state. Even in Texas, where the Attorney General, I guess this state as well, Florida, make it a habit of suing the federal government. 3 of us on Commissioners Court decided we're going to go to court and we're going to sue the state. Many advocates question whether the agency should have the power to self-certify environmental impacts. Harris County also filed a Title VI civil rights complaint. Obviously, when you file those as a county governmental entity, you have to file them on behalf of citizens. We couldn't file it on behalf of the county, but we had the resources, so we filed a Title VI complaint for some of our citizens because we believe that the use of federal funds for this project would have a discriminatory impact, violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Various other groups filed their own Title VI complaints as well. The lawsuit and complaint upset TxDOT, ticked them off. The agency's used to getting its way, and is certainly accustomed to carving up those poor neighborhoods, primarily of color, and getting away with it all around the country. Understanding the magnitude of the project, the Federal Highway Administration within the Department of Transportation ordered TxDOT to pause the project and all associated activities. We worked the politics. We raised a lot of cane. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee in particular, Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia, we got tremendous support. Still, even after the federal government ordered TxDOT to pause, the relocation specialists were still reaching out to residents, making them offers to buy their homes. So we went back to meet with the federal government in DC. And they had to come back and explain to TxDOT, stop means stop. Which part of stop do you not understand? That was a bold step, I think. This was the resistance that TxDOT, the most resistance that TxDOT had ever had in the history of Texas. In a public tantrum, TxDOT threatened to yank all funding associated with this project. They tried to create an impossible choice for us, basically saying that Harris County would be forced to lose all funding to even repair an unsafe old highway or displace longstanding communities to make room for more cars. That was a choice. And then they told our allies in other cities in Texas, we'll give you Houston's money. Now, Jeff invited me because I did a bike ride in 100-degree weather early in the morning, and I couldn't find my talking points when I got to the rally. So I just kind of went unscripted, basically saying that the TxDOT had done a monkey poll. And I remember when I was drinking, they used to have this drink, if you're old enough to remember, called Brass Monkey. And I said, there's a reason why they called it a Brass Monkey drink, because it will make you act like a monkey. Now, I never said the people at TxDOT were monkeys. I just used it to kind of get their attention. So they got pretty angry. And we got a lot of pressure from us, but we didn't back down. And we're committed to trying to save our city, to push forward values that matter to our neighborhoods. On the ground, this is what we think that looks like. This is what we want. If we can't stop it, I get that. That's difficult. Jeff, although I remember from your talk, that's basically what you said. Here's what it would look like on the ground to make substantial changes. Redesigning the project to minimize the right-of-way acquisitions that would displace homes, places of worship, and businesses. If there's still displacements after a redesign, TxDOT would have to adequately compensate private market renters, public housing residents, and homeowners alike by offering above market rate compensation and investing in a publicly controlled housing trust. Merely providing market rate compensation for a generation's old home in the historic Fifth Ward doesn't allow displaced residents to remain in the quickly gentrifying neighborhood. There's nothing else that they can buy. They'd have to move out into the wild, wild west, away from jobs and everything else. We deserve reconnected communities with safe streets, with pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, as well as transit options. The agency must also step into the future and include dedicated transit lanes on the highway to incentivize bus ridership. We need to mitigate all impacts. We want them to mitigate all impacts related to noise, air quality, flooding, and build a 21st century multimodal infrastructure to safely move people and goods. We're not the only Texas city fighting TxDOT. San Antonio, Dallas, Austin, El Paso are all facing major freeway expansions. Nationally, highway expansions are facing pushback from communities in Oregon to Wisconsin. Harris County is going to keep fighting for our homes, our communities, and transit solutions that connect us instead of dividing us. We're setting, we hope, a standard by being aggressive on projects like this. Look, in my county, here's where we're headed. We're chasing a vision of connection, starting with policy. When I switched and became a county commissioner, that governing body, when I got there, was a lonely place to be. It was fun. It's pretty lonely being in the Senate as well, being in minority. But when I came to Commissioner's Court, I guess I did stand out a little bit. Most folks wouldn't go from 27 years in the state Senate to go to county government. I wouldn't have done it either, but for the power that a Harris County Commissioners has. In 2019, for the first time, we had a progressive majority on the court, and we made a difference. For the first time in our county government, we've centered equity in policymaking, from housing to roads to flood control. We have billions of dollars of infrastructure needs and investments, and we have to take into account decades of neglect. We're not just talking about equity, we are enshrining it in policy and our built environment. We're making investments and making tough decisions about how to allocate limited resources. Equity is now a part of our guidelines for all projects and our training of staff for developing infrastructure. We passed a bond issue after Harvey, $2.5 billion. For the first time, we're considering social vulnerability as a score and indice for deciding which projects to prioritize. As some of you know, if you're in the areas prone to flooding, most federal money goes out on the basis of a cost-benefit ratio. That means you fund the wealthier neighborhoods first. And generally, you never get to the neighborhoods who are flooded all the time. So we essentially adopted a worse first policy. I'm not crazy. I know you got to protect the medical center. I know you have to protect downtown. I know you have to protect the port. But something is wrong if you put more value in the house I live in now than the house I came out of, if that house floods more. The prioritization framework is not popular, but we're no longer standing by and watching some communities flood all the time. We're also leading by example. With our regional toll road authority, we're incorporating multimodal transit designs into the projects that we do, including a ship channel bridge, which leads to the largest port for foreign tonnage in this country. That's the Port of Houston. We've even paused other large projects to conduct redesign and ensure that road and bridge work connects communities and provides them with options instead of separating them. These concepts are reimagining how our network and toll roads become multimodal spaces for leisure, celebration, and transit. Even in a city lacking sufficient public transit, we're focusing on transit-oriented development. Before we make any decisions, we look at factors that matter to people most. And of course, we're not backing down against the highway expansion. We want to do something that will help our region. I can't go into the specifics of the litigation because the other side will pick it up and depose me based on what they think I meant if I say something. But I want to conclude with this. Without having any idea how that I-45 expansion is going to come out, we're going to fight it. We're going to raise all of the issues. We can't afford to repeat the paradigm that we've gone through so many times in the past. Hopefully, by sharing this story, I hope it'll motivate you to do what you can when you go back to wherever you're from. We had a nice, clean-cut, soft-spoken guy come into our town and rile us up. So I hope when you go back to wherever you're from, you make equity the focus of what you do as well. Thank you.
That was very inspiring. So now we'll take questions for both Rodney Ellis and Mike McGinn. So, yes.
I've got a question. Jared Jacquet from Pensacola, Florida. So,
Speak up.
Jared Jacquet from Pensacola, Florida. Through the equity lens, how do you combine housing and transportation improvements to make sure that bike lane and walkability improvements don't lead to the displacement of previous residents, so that they can enjoy those benefits? We've often had those residents express concern about improvements because they might be priced out of their residence if the neighborhood has a renaissance.
Gentrification. You want to jump in? So this is how I look at it. Look, I ran for city council because I was angry we didn't have sidewalks in the neighborhood I grew up in. I had a great job with a member of Congress, very popular guy, replaced Barbara Jordan, Mickey Leland. Look, back then, Mayor, 83, I think I was making $67.5 a year. City council was paying $25. But I wanted sidewalks in Sunnyside, that poor neighborhood I grew up in. And then I got on the city council and found out, well, hell, we don't have zoning. The developers put in the sidewalks. So we had no sidewalks in that neighborhood because we didn't want to pay more for that house. I don't want to, when I put these bike lanes in, it was easy to run a protected bike lane through downtown Houston. If you've been there, I live by Rice University. So I can get from Herman Park to downtown. I did that as my last project out of that $10 million. First, I did a bike lane from downtown, passing by the jail, getting to LBJ Hospital, way out in a poor income neighborhood. And this was the theory. I said, if more people in that public hospital walked or rode a bike to downtown, maybe they wouldn't be in that public hospital. But so I just don't think that I can't be from a neighborhood where I run for office because I wanted my neighborhood that I came out of to have all of the nice things that other neighborhoods have. And then if you put them in, you're worried about it displacing people. We got to put more of a focus in affordable housing out of our ARPA money. I'm gonna push to try to take as much as $200 million of it and put it into affordable housing. I'm fighting an NIMBY thing. You know, I've been in office 38 years. Hell, if they defeat me, so what? I can go make up. You know, they tell me my kids are pretty nice people. I don't really know them. It wouldn't be the end of the world if I didn't have honorable in front of my name. But so I'm going to push for those other things, the amenities that help. I wish I could have gotten our city to do the dockless bikes. And putting those B-cycle stations in neighborhoods, and we're subsidizing them so that B-cycle has to give a deeper discount in the poor neighborhoods. And look, I'm encouraging people. You know, Jeff, I've seen your TED Talk about, you know, one of the biggest growth industries in poor communities, whatever color you are, would be these dialysis centers. You know, at some point, we'd be giving them tax breaks to set them up everywhere. We got to get people out moving again. We got to teach them how to eat. I know the rule is 80-20. 80% is what you eat, but this food's so good. So you got to improve it,
You know, what I've discovered, no, I shouldn't say this. I won't say that. But I'm going to say it. I discovered from press conferences the number of years that somebody's been in office seems to correlate to the length of the answers, Rodney. And I was only in for 4 years, but I'm gonna test you. I'm gonna test you on that. You know, here's the thing on that same question, you know, oftentimes the infrastructure is following the gentrification, not causing it, but it is a real concern. But here's the deal. The reason there's so much pressure on that neighborhood for housing is because so many neighborhoods have locked people out. And that's really what we need to be thinking about. The neighborhoods that have nice sidewalks, that have leafy green streets, that have nice neighborhood business districts, and that exclude people have to be opened up. You know, I knew people in Seattle from immigrant and refugee communities, they'd rent whatever they could get so that they could send their kids to the better schools in the city, right? Because they were locked out. Why aren't we opening up those neighborhoods with all the amenities? If you don't want to put pressure on these, and there are oftentimes, as we know, in the last few decades, people are moving back to the core. That was the place that was left behind. Those are the abandoned places. Now people are moving back, and what we're finding is low income and immigrant and refugee communities and historic Black communities are all being pushed to the suburban edge, which has horrible amenities, which needs to be fixed. But we need to be allowing more housing near the centers. We need to be allowing more housing in the single-family neighborhoods that are excluding people. And that's, I think, everybody should have access to great amenities. And let's, start there, I think is the real key to fixing the gentrification issue. Really focusing on investing in affordable housing and unlocking exclusionary zoning.
The scale of the issues in cities like Seattle and Houston being so massive by the nature of how big those places are, how do you guys decide where to prioritize those dollars? Dollars are fine, you can't spread them over evenly across all communities. We'd love to put marginalized places first, just understand there are needs in these other cities as well. I'd love to get your sense of people getting into the trenches, what that looks like.
I'll go first and be real tight. It's just a fight. Like, budgets are fights. And if you get to draft the budget, and budgets are moral documents too, if you get to draft the first cut of the budget, you can try to push the money where you want it to, and then it'll head to the next level, and everyone's going to show up, and the votes will be where the votes go. And you've got to give people, it's kind of like who's your base. I'm going to add one more topic here. So many local elections across the country are held in odd years. And that's a remnant of the progressive era where the progressives then, the reform movement then, wanted to break the power of the big city bosses, and they were oftentimes relying on poor voters, right? Tammany Hall and the rest. That was adopted along with a whole bunch of other reforms, and it's actually working today, 100 years later, exactly the way is intended, which is to, what it tends to do is it tends to privilege the more privileged, right? And that's who votes in local elections. So moving to even year elections for all local races would dramatically change the electorate, and that would help change where the money should go. And, you know, in listening to Rodney, I'm going to hand this over to him quickly. How do you do it? He just told you how he does it, right? You win, you get a majority, and you put the money there.
Yeah, you know, I'm a graduate of LBJ school, and when I was on probation, I listened to all those LBJ tapes. Back when he had that big old machine, you'd have to listen to him. And I love this line that he had about power is to be used when you have it. What the hell is power for if you don't use it? You don't wait till you're out and you're looking at it in the rearview mirror. You know, in politics, we pass a lot of resolutions. Drives me nuts. You know, the only thing that I can do free would be the resolutions, other than the trees you kill with all of the paper. And it makes the person getting it so happy. I have to tell people it costs money, and you got to pay for it. And if you don't want to pay for it, you can't get it. Now, so far, it hadn't thrown me out of office. But, you know, if I go do a sidewalk, I cut a ribbon for a bike trail the other day, and they were so happy. I rode my bike down there, Mayor. And then about 5 people, I couldn't get away from them. I'm glad I got a new road bike so I could get out of there. They have 10 other ideas, and I said, that's a good idea. What you think if I could raise your taxes to get, oh, no. Take it from somewhere else. You use social media, but you have to convince people. If you want it, you got to invest in it. Difficult. And then you use equity, by the way. That's what we did on that bond issue. I wanted 3 things. I wanted big enough so you could get to the neighborhoods that always flood and never get the funding. Number 2, I wanted some equity guidelines. I didn't define it. I was in the minority, but they knew usually my crowd will vote for the tax increase. They didn't want me out there campaigning against it. And then I wanted a program for minority and women-owned businesses. And they did all 3. Now, if my side, if the Democrats hadn't taken over, I think once it was over with, they would have said, well, we made a mistake. We didn't understand that.
Boy, you've really got me thinking about this question. So I mentioned this was a $4 billion tunnel. City of Seattle, you know, had a whole bunch of its own money that they had to do stuff. The city council was undeniably for it. Like 8 of the 9 city council members were for it. And it happened like that. And then the next thing was we were going to have a magnificent waterfront. And this was something that was wanted by the wealthiest people in town because it was, you know, it was going to be their monument to what they provided to Seattle, right? At the same time in the city of Seattle, I was putting forward measures to increase the money for the Seattle Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. I proposed $800,000 more to extend it to age 21 from 18 into more neighborhoods. I put in money for something called law enforcement assisted diversion. Instead of an officer sending someone to jail, they could send them straight to treatment. I think I asked for like $1 million more for that. I put in a program to start a program for dollars that would come from dollars to be used for incarcerated men who were returning to the formerly incarcerated, returning to the community, right? If we could give them housing and community support and a little bit of cash, that's really good. It's really good to do because that's where a lot of the crime comes from, are people coming back who are shunned and they don't have the supports to help them. Every one of them was cut or stopped by that same city council. And they did the same thing on every one. They said, show me the data as to why it's effective. We don't believe this is the best way to spend the money, right? There's a different way to spend it. Did the same thing on homeless spending. Show me the data. We don't think this is effective. So what I learned, and by the way, I remember I was meeting with the black pastors in Seattle one time. They said, how come the council fights that? And I would tell them the data thing. And they'd say, well, how come the council fights that? And I'd say, well, they say the data. And they said, well, how come they fight that? They say the data. And finally, I just had to tell them the truth. This is how it is. If it's money for black or brown people, it's subjected to exacting scrutiny for effectiveness. Now, if it's money that the big donors wanted for a magnificent waterfront, there wasn't even a discussion. We were going to find it. And that's why races matter. That's why elections matter. That's why volunteering in races matter. right? Because I didn't have the majority on the council. I did not. And we fought them. We got a few things through, but we just always had to fight. And they would hate me saying that. They would really hate me saying that because they're all good people on the council. They're all progressives. They all say they're Dems. They would really hate me saying that that's what it was. But I don't care what they felt in their hearts. I saw what they did every time. And you see that nationwide. You see it in a lot of communities. And, so how do you get the money to the good places? Well, you gotta fight like hell and elect good people. That's how you can do it.